Sometimes it's good to break out of the shackles of regularity, and I appreciate it when a developer tries to create something a little bit different.
It's a risky strategy, as failure isn't just an option, it's a likely outcome. But even when such a project does sink like a stone, sometimes it bubbles up a few flavourful ideas that help to make future games better. Hi, I'm Caliban, and today we're going to look at 5 unusual strategy and tactics games. I'm not really sure if they're all what you'd call good, but they are at the very least interesting.
I enjoyed playing them all, and as most of them are cheap, free, or have a demo available, I thought you might want to take a look too. So let's not get too carried away with the crazy too quickly and take a look at Tooth and Tail, an arcade RTS from 2017. It's unusual in a couple of different ways, so let's tackle the cosmetic one first and talk about the setting. Rather than your usual fare of ancient empires, modern militaries, or fantasy characters, Tooth and Tail is set in what appears to be a post-Tsarist inspired animal kingdom, where the common folk are hungry and there's revolution in the air. It's a society of creatures with the rodents at the top and everything else as a subservient underclass, and different factions of rats battling it out over one ideology or another. What's unusual about the game engine itself is it's been designed and built from the ground up to support proper cross-platform play. This is particularly impressive, as RTS style action has always been pretty difficult when you've only got access to a gamepad, and normal attempts to resolve this have never been much more than an afterthought. But not with Tooth and Tail. Rather than direct control of each unit, you use your D-pad or WASD keys to move your commander around a battlefield, and then you rally your troops to your location in order to do battle. You can then use another button to cycle the highlighted unit type, allowing you to command different parts of your forces separately. This might sound a bit fiddly, as the game does include 20 different units, but because of your pre-match build you can only produce up to 8 different types in a single battle. It's worth noting that your commander is also just that. It's not a hero unit and has no combat ability whatsoever. If it dies, it respawns after a few seconds, but that's still something you want to avoid, as while waiting for that respawn you've got no control over your army. It's quite cleverly constructed. You've got one button to rally the current group and another to rally everyone. Press it once and they move to attack, press and hold and they follow you in retreat. A separate key acts as your context-sensitive build button. If you're on the open ground, it will build a production structure of the unit group you've got selected. If you're on empty farmland, it will build a farm, and if you're next to a capturable mill, it will spend the resources to make it yours. The production structures are also highly automated. The low tier ones often support up to 3 units. You place one down and it will keep building until it's reached the maximum number of units, and when one of those units dies, it will just start production on a replacement automatically. The higher tier structures can only support 1 or 2 units, but they work in exactly the same way. This simplicity makes the game both fast paced and really easy to learn, and I got to grips with it after only a couple of skirmishes. I've heard the terms action RTS and arcade RTS before, but generally I've found them to mean not an RTS. But Tooth and Tail is the first game I've seen where that tag feels particularly appropriate. Another feature that really impressed me was the maps, as they're randomised and procedurally generated, so every new battle feels different from the last. You've got a single resource to worry about, which is food, which is acquired by building farms around a mill in something that looks a little bit like Age of Empires. After a while the farmland will run dry, so you have to constantly keep expanding, locating new ruined mills around the map, capturing them and then building new farms around them. On top of this, the game's got a pretty detailed story mode where you get to learn how it all works and discover the tale of the revolution. You get to play as one of 4 different characters as the plot unfolds, and between missions you get a little area to run around and talk to the locals. The whole game is really well executed, and I think it's a great example of how indie developers can make something fun, smart and different in a space that's been pretty stale for a while. The battles are fast, furious and short, and if you want something interesting and lightweight to try, then I don't think you can go far wrong with Tooth and Tail, especially if you can pick it up in a sale at a next to nothing price like I did. Now let's leave the animal kingdom behind and move into something a bit more recognisable in the form of 2018's Call to Arms. It's got a modern setting and a variety of missions that have a very Middle Eastern theme to them. You've got access to a selection of infantry and armoured fighting vehicles that you can use to varying levels of effect as you defend bases, root out AK wielding bad guys and bring your own particular brand of freedom to the locals. It's got quite a reasonable level of detail. All of your infantry and vehicles look the part and are equipped with the kind of weapons you'd expect to find. Most soldiers have also got an inventory, and you do have to worry about things like ammo and medkits if you want to keep your force in a fit fighting condition. It's not too difficult to rearm and equip, although you'll end up kicking yourself the first time you forget to replenish your AT weapons and some sort of 1960s Russian-made junk comes rolling over the hill at you. So why is it unusual? Well, because of this button. By pressing E, you assume direct control of an individual soldier or vehicle and can go into a full FPS to take out particularly troublesome opponents or clear out buildings. It gives the game a really interesting dynamic, as on the one hand you're obviously way more effective than a computer controlled soldier, but on the other hand you instantly lose all objectivity and forget you're supposed to be managing the rest of the battle. Direct control feels more than a quick gimmick, it's well done and quite fun for both infantry and vehicle work. It's a really powerful force multiplier, but the downsides are very obvious, and as such it's at its most effective when it's used sparingly. I have seen similar mechanics before in other games, but I think one of the reasons why it works so well in Call to Arms is the realistic amount of ammunition that each soldier can carry. This prevents you from going on a prolonged one-man killing spree, as a couple of hundred rounds on a single AT weapon is not going to win you the game. Direct control also doesn't turn you into Rambo, and enemy fire, particularly from automatic weapons, will cut you down in pretty short order. It's not the kind of game that I play very often, but every once in a while I'll break it out for an evening as it's a nice change of pace. Being an older game, it's pretty affordable, and it's available for around $15 on Steam, even at a normal list price. If you end up enjoying it, then there's some DLC available too, and there's also a Second World War themed standalone expansion called Gates of Hell Ostfront, which came out in 2021. Now let's move away from warfare and onto law enforcement, with No Plan B, a tactical game that went into full release earlier this year. It's a SWAT style tactical game where you've got to guide your operatives through the kind of engagements that are well established in this genre. You know, barricaded suspects, hostage rescue, bomb defusal and that sort of thing. It's got the sort of blocky graphical feel that's synonymous with many indie games these days, and I think it's a perfect choice for visualising the action without requiring a warehouse full of developers. You've also got lots of customization options for your agents, both functional and cosmetic. As well as changing the look and feel of your characters' clothing and headwear, there's a decent amount of weapons available with rifles, pistols, shotguns, SMGs and a smattering of grenades and shields. The game is divided up into training, campaign mode and standalone missions. The campaigns have some sort of persistence and require success to continue, while the other missions are just a simple in and out sort of affair. To its credit, the demo is pretty generous on the free content. I got to play all of the tutorial, 3 of the missions and the first chapter of the campaign all without paying a penny, and it was easily enough to convince me to buy the full game, which I did the next day. What makes No Plan B a little different is all of the gameplay and decision making happens within the planning stages of a mission before a single door is kicked or a single shot is fired. There's a very in-depth system of movement, facing, action and timeline synchronization that lets you plan each short engagement in meticulous detail. Your job is to properly plan each entry, stack up on the doors, toss grenades and then pass the threshold while covering all of the angles and proceeding through each room until it's been swept clean. The planning stages take place in a wooden mock-up of the target, and once you click the execute button you're then shown the real area of engagement and get to watch your careful planning come to fruition. The idea itself is a pretty cool one, and it's seriously helped by the fact that it's so well done. I've got the feeling I've tried something a bit similar in the past, but I distinctly remember the controls and interface were too convoluted to make the experience enjoyable. No Plan B does not have this problem. It's well designed and the interface is thoughtfully constructed, resulting in a game where you spend the majority of your time enjoying the planning rather than fighting with the input system. I don't want to go into too much detail as I'm only a few hours in, but so far I've enjoyed it a lot, and if you like this sort of thing then I really recommend you give it a try. The demo is available for download on the Steam store and the full game is reasonably priced at around $15. Now let's take the unusual up a notch with an RTS that you probably don't have the skills to play. It might have all the regular hallmarks of a real-time strategy game, resource gathering, base building and unit production, but Screeps Arena is no usual RTS. The catch is that you don't actually have any direct control over your forces. Instead, you've got to write the AI control code that makes everything work. This is all done at a really low level. The game is divided into ticks, and with each new tick, the loop in your control code is executed, and your units respond to your pre-written instructions. I was having a play around with the demo the other week, and it's got a multi-stage tutorial that shows you how to do all of the basics like gather, build and attack. Graphically it's not much to look at, but that's really not the point. It's a very simple execution, but it does the job and you can easily understand what's happening on the screen even if it does look a little bland. This is very much a niche game aimed at programmers and enthusiasts, so I've got no idea if it's popular or not. It's based on an earlier project called Screeps, which is a sandbox MMO for programmers that I'll admit I have zero understanding of whatsoever. In this particular game, the language of choice is JavaScript. Now, I happen to have a little experience with this. In my professional life, I've worked on a lot of back-end projects for web applications, and some of those tasks have had just enough crossover that I've picked up a little bit of JavaScript along the way. Thankfully, you're dealing with a lot of existing modules that give you access to some useful functions for things like pathfinding, locating the closest unit, and that sort of stuff, so you don't need to be an absolute code wizard, but apart from that, you're very much on your own. This is the final tutorial mission. There are 3 enemies trapped behind a barricade that will take some time to destroy it before they'll make a beeline to your base and try to wipe it clean. Your job is to gather some resources and build some units to defend it. Using what I learned from the other tutorial stages, I over-engineered a solution that was pleasing to me, and after a lot of trial and error managed to get it working in a somewhat acceptable way. This here's my control code. I first define a few things like the minimum number of workers and defenders that I want, and then I also decide what I want my units to look like. There are no predefined troops in Screeps, essentially they're just a blank slate with a maximum number of body locations, so you can kind of invent your own army. The more body locations you use, the more expensive they are, so I created a few useful default templates for a peasant, an armsman, a gunner and a medic. And this is the start of my loop that runs each tick. First I get a load of data from the system, like what friendly and enemy units are in play, and then I do my opening check. Do I have the minimum number of workers? If not, I tell my spawn points to build one. After that, I tell any workers that do exist to go and gather. It's a pretty simple process. I loop through a list of them and tell each one to harvest from the nearest source, and if that returns an out of range error, I instead instruct them to move towards it. I also check if their carry capacity is full, and if so, then they instead return to the base and drop off that energy. I then check to see if I've got the minimum number of defenders. If I don't, then I instruct my spawn points to create some, which they'll happily do as long as they've got energy and they're not currently busy. My third important check simply asks, are there any enemies within 10 squares of my spawn point? If so, I instruct any nearby defenders to attack them, or if they're out of range to move towards them. My final check is a little bit of tidy up. If there's no enemies close by, I tell my defenders to take up positions around my spawn point, ready to intercept any intruders that happen to come within range. AI bot control code in strategy games is a particularly interesting topic to me, and having a little go and creating some myself was a really pleasant distraction. It also raises some important questions. If your control code handles everything, then do you even need to be online during matchmaking? You could potentially have a very niche game with a small audience that still has a ready supply of instant games, and then as a player you could review your results and make some tweaks whenever you happen to be online. I thought that was a pretty interesting concept. Now, in strategy and tactics games, we're pretty comfortable with setting stuff ablaze and directing rapid fire onto our enemies, but we're not quite so used to trying to extinguish those fires or call for an ambulance. This is where our next game comes into play. You see, a few videos ago I made some glib comment about 3 games labelled as an RTS on the Steam store that couldn't possibly have been one. But the other day I noticed that one of them was free to play, so I decided to actually try it. What I found was Emergency, and honestly, it might be an RTS or at least some kind of strategy or tactics game that for once has absolutely no military angle whatsoever. You take command of the emergency services and must respond to, well, emergencies. You're given authority over a small section of the city, stuff goes wrong and it's your job to extinguish fires, save lives or bring order to chaos. You've got access to 10 different emergency vehicles, fire trucks, paramedics, patrol cars and that sort of thing. During every mission you've got to complete a number of emergencies, with a new one appearing about the same time that you resolve the previous. It's a very accident-prone city, and trucks will frequently crash into EV charging stations. Buildings will randomly catch fire, and armed gangs will try to raid an ATM, or any number of other convoluted and hazardous situations will evolve. Your job is to dispatch the right services and direct their attention in the proper way before the problem gets out of hand or the city's panic level rises to unacceptable levels. Each emergency requires the attention of several different services in a particular order, and you'll have to dispatch various vehicles and then recall them to make space for others. In this one here, a semi-truck has swerved off the road and crashed into a power transformer. The driver's injured, and there's someone else trapped in the car behind it that's been partially crushed by the truck shedding its load of iron girders. First of all, we've got to dispatch a patrol car and send the officers to go and disperse the nearby crowd with a liberal dose of nothing to see here. Bystanders are inherently stupid, and if you don't get them moved out of the way, then they've got a habit of getting themselves electrocuted or partially incinerated, requiring you to use your limited resources to attend to their foolishness rather than dealing with the actual problem. Once that's done, I need to dispatch an engineer to get the power shut off to render the area safe, and then call in a doctor to treat the critically wounded driver. Now that I've got no further need for my engineer, I can return him back to base to free up a slot, and then bring in a crane for later. Those girders aren't going to move themselves after all. Now the driver's out of the critical condition, my paramedic can scoop him up and take him to hospital, freeing up another 2 slots that I can use for a second ambulance and a fire truck. My crane has freed the car, so now I can order my firefighters out of their transport and direct them to use the big choppy claw thing to free the trapped driver. Then in goes the paramedic and the poor victim gets carted off to the emergency room. Just as I'm wrapping this up, there's another call from dispatch. Some knife-wielding lunatics are trying to stab up a group of pedestrians who until very recently were enjoying a nice walk by the river. This requires a bigger police presence, so I immediately dispatch 3 patrol cars and direct the officers into the ever-evolving Royal Rumble. They arrest the evildoers, cuff them and cart them off to the cells, while I deftly steer my paramedics towards the downed civilians. It's a bit of a bumpy ride up the stairs, but the wounded are safely taken to the waiting ambulances and then off for some well-earned rest and recovery, and probably some stitches. I don't really know how to classify this game. It feels like a small squad tactics game from some sort of alternate universe. You can move your units about, use their special abilities, and you've got far more direct control than you would in a sim-style game that features this sort of subject matter. There are some real elements of strategy in how to tackle a particular problem, and because you can only dispatch 5 vehicles at once, you've got to put some real thought into what to call, when to call it, and where to park it. There are also other decisions. Do you call a regular fire truck that's got better capabilities but requires access to a hydrant? Or do you call a water tender that's got its own supply? You can also play the game with others, and I assume some of the more higher level jobs probably require some sort of cooperation. It does seem that there have been several games in the Emergency series, and from what I've read it does have a small but rather loyal following. However, my apologies to those fans, as apparently this latest instalment wasn't too well received. Some of the reviewers claim that it's a real dumbing down of the series and contains way too many microtransactions and other such rubbish, but as a newcomer with zero preconceptions, I found it quite enjoyable. I only intended to play it for half an hour to see what it was like, but I ended up spending a whole evening putting out fires, rescuing people from tall buildings and righting various wrongs. Like all of the games on this list, it's not something that I put a lot of playtime into, but the fact it didn't cost me a penny made it very attractive. And if you want to prevent explosions instead of causing them for an evening, then I recommend you have a go. And there you have it. 5 unusual strategy and tactics games that are perfect for when you want to give your regular catalogue a break and play something a little bit different. I love it when developers try out some new or less common ideas. It's something to be celebrated, and we should keep supporting those who do it. Hi there, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, click the like button. And if you've played some of these games before, let me know how you got on in a comment or maybe on the Discord. And as usual, if you want more of this sort of thing, then subscribe to my channel and I hope to see you back soon.